And we are officially recording now. So Ciana, take it away.
All right, thank you so much. As Antonio mentioned, my name is Ciana. I am from the Kingdom of Antir, and we are going to be discussing Camicia today. So we're going to be going through a number of sections. So we're going to start with some pictorial sources, primarily portraits. We are then going to look at some extant garments. We're then going to talk about measurements and layout, what you're going to measure, how you're going to measure it, and some tips and tricks there. And then we're going to talk about actual construction. It's pretty basic, but there's a couple of little weird things that we're going to make sure that we tick off. And then we're going to wrap up with a discussion of necklines and cuffs, because there is a significant amount of variation. So that is kind of where we are headed for the day. I'm going to be sharing a Google Slides PowerPoint presentation thing, but I'm going to be turning it off again between each section and then turning it back on again so that we have a chance to check in. So with that, we are going to jump in. Just before we do that, we are covering the full sort of fluffy version of the Camicia that sort of starts appearing around 1480 and carries on through the 1500s. So that's the version of the Camicia that we're going to be discussing today. And with that, we are going to jump into this PowerPoint and some portraits. Okay. Can everybody see the PowerPoint?
Coming in clear for me.
Perfect. Okay. So as I said, this is primarily focused on the 16th century Camicia on the Italian peninsula. It does start showing up a little bit before 1500, and we do have, I think, at least one portrait that is pre-1500, but primarily from 1500 through to 1600. Oh dear, there's no date on that, except it's at the bottom. Okay, so this is from 1488. Somehow it did not get up to the top of the slide. I will fix that before I share the slides with everyone. So this is Giovanna de Medici. So we can see here the fullness of her Camicia. We've got lots of pleats or gathers at the front here, sticking through where her sleeve is tied on. This could be added onto the sleeve as opposed to sticking through the sleeve, but it's probably sticking through. So we know we have a significant amount of fullness in that sleeve from the back and the side and all of these things. The Camicia here does not show significantly at the neckline. You're not getting a wide band or anything, and it doesn't stick out significantly from her sleeve. Here we have a much later portrait. This one, well, it's not a portrait, it's a woodcut, and it's from Venice. It's from 1590. This is a Cesare Vecellio. And this portrait, or this picture, I love because it is this lady bleaching her hair in Venice, and she's only in her Camicia. So we get to see a lot of detail. One of the things that I found most interesting about this particular image is it looks like her sleeves of her Camicia in this image do not have cuffs. And although it's not in the presentation, I believe there is at least one other image that backs this up, despite there not being any extant Camicia that don't have cuffs. We can see there is some kind of embroidery or insertion lace And there is some amount of decoration around the neckline. And we can also tell that this particular Camicia is quite long. She is sitting, which does affect how much of her it's covering, but in a sitting posture, it is coming down all the way to her ankles. So this is probably pretty long. I would say probably coming to mid-calf at the least. So this is another Venetian image. This is a portrait of a young woman by Carpaccio. And on this one, again, we see the fullness. We see that it's not coming up significantly past the neckline of the main bodice. And we can see an actual band at the front here between the opening of her overdress. It looks like there's probably some amount of embroidery or decoration on that band, but we can see that there is a flat band that all of the fullness of her Camicia is being gathered into. This is an image from Florence. This is the 1530s. So here, the things that I wanted to point out are we've got these big fluffy ruffles at her cuffs, but we have quite a straight neckline. And it may be decorated, and it is sticking up a little bit above her overdress. Then we have this image, which is from Venice in 1590s. This is a Tintoretto. And here, again, we see lots of fullness. This one, it's hard to tell. These sleeves could actually not have cuffs, but they may. It's a little hard to see what is happening right around her wrist here. But we do have a ruffle at the neckline, quite a fluffy one. And we can see there is sort of a straight line underneath that ruffle, and then lots of fullness in the actual Camicia, in the body and in the sleeves. And then last but not least, we've got an image here from 1560 that I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with. This is Bronzino, and we can just, in this time period, we can just see the very edge of her Camicia sticking out above the neckline. It looks like there's probably black work on it. Again, with her sleeves, this could be the Camicia being pulled out between panels, or this could be stitched puffs that are stitched there so that they stay in place. If you have ever tried wearing sleeves that are intended to have puffs sticking out, especially with the regularity and small puffs that these sleeves are, it's often hard to keep your Camicia sleeves actually puffing nice and regular this way. So it's very possible that the puffs that are in this sleeve are not actually her Camicia, but are in fact stitched as part of the sleeves. But she does still, we can see at her wrist, we can see the edge of her Camicia sleeve. We can see that it has that black work that is the same as what she has at her neckline. And it looks again like these Camicia sleeves may not actually have a cuff on them. So that was a super quick run through of a handful of portraits, trying to get a little bit across the peninsula and across that time period. Does anybody have any questions before we move on to looking at some extant garments? Just going to give a couple of minutes for people to process, and then I'll move on.
Definitely. And I'm not seeing anything pop up yet in the chat. So again, if anyone has any questions, feel free to either type them up or turn on your mic.
Mm-hmm. give it another 30 seconds or so, and then we'll move.
Sounds good.
And while we're waiting, I will say this class probably will not take the full 2 hours. I just know that it's going to take more than 50 minutes. So I grabbed a 2-hour slot. So just so that everybody's aware, we have the time if people have a lot of questions at the end, but I would be very surprised if this actually takes 2 hours. Okay, we are going to keep running then. So extant Camicia. We are pretty lucky. There are actually quite a few of these in museums. However, most of them do date significantly later. So we're talking, most of these are in the sort of 1580s to 1650s. We don't really have anything extant that is in the earlier 1500s or into that sort of like 1480, 1490. But as we saw in the paintings, there is a significant amount of similarities that we can see from those Camicia that we see around the 1480s to those Camicia that we see in the 1580s. And so using the extant garments that we have, I feel is a very reasonable thing in terms of looking at construction. Additionally, a lot of the extant items that we have are, as we would expect, very high class garments. So most of them are very heavily decorated. We definitely saw in looking through the portraiture that not all Camicia are decorated. They don't have to be, but that is what we're going to be seeing as we are looking through these extant items. So this particular item is in the Met Museum. We also have this one, which is from the V&A. So with both of these, you can see they've got the big sleeves. We've got a lot of fabric in the body, a neckline, cuffs, and lots of decorations. This is a drawn image of an item that was published in Cut My Coat, and which there's some information about on Realm of Venus. It is in a museum, but it's not a museum that has digitized any images about this particular item. So this is some information about that item on the last page. So the gussets of that particular one are 9 inches square. The distance from the lowest gusset to the neck edge is 13 inches, which means that part of the sleeve is set into the body, but most of the sleeve is left free from the body of the garment. The sleeves are 25 inches wide, so they're about 12.5 inches when folded in half. The neck circumference is approximately 26 inches. It's got a 39-inch neck to hem measurement. And this one is made with center panels and side panels. So the center panels are 28 inches and the side panels are 14 inches. So there's 2 side panels and 2 body panels. However, there are also 2 extant Camicias that are detailed in Patterns of Fashion 4. They're both pre-1600s. There's a lot of good photos and layouts in Patterns of Fashion. Both of them are heavily embroidered and have needle lace at the neckline. So this one is from the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. The embroidery is not black work. It is, I believe, a red silk on this particular one. All of the extant Camicias seem to be monochrome. So they're not necessarily black work, but they are a single color. It's not multicolored embroidery. So there is a layout for this Camicia in Patterns of Fashion. And this one, along with the other one, where we're going to look at the layout in a sec, these are just a single front and back panel. but they follow the same construction concept, with the sleeve being set a little bit into the body and then the gusset added, and then it's stitched up. So personally, I did one version that has side panels. You have to cut into the side panels to place the gussets and the sleeve. Personally, both because we have extant versions that don't have those side panels, and also because I believe that the side panels were because of the width of the fabric that they happen to have. And assuming you have fabric that is wide enough, I would not bother with the side panels. They just add an extra seam that ends up kind of hitting you right around here. And unless you finish them really nicely, they're just annoying more than anything else. So I personally recommend just a front and a back body panel, and that is the construction method that I am going to be working us through today. But just so that you are aware, there are versions that have that side panels with the front panel. There is a much more detailed explanation of how that construction works on Realm of Venus. And if you happen to end up with some linen that is super, super narrow and you want to use that method instead, you can totally go and check out that method. It is totally period. It is based on an extant garment, and it totally does work. You just really want to finish your seams nicely. We also have, this is the other one that is from Patterns of Fashion 4. So this one is, I take it back. This one's not monochrome. This one is purple and silver. So there you go. You can do whatever you want when it comes to decorating your Camicia. Like, rules are made to be broken, right? So again, there is a very fancy needle lace neckline on this particular one. We've got the big full sleeves, lots of gathers into the body here. And again, we can see the layout here. Basically, this square here is the sleeve. These are your body panels here. And then this is your gusset, which is going to be inserted under the sleeve. And we've got some additional information on here about kind of the needle lace and the sizing and all that kind of stuff. I will be posting these slides after the class is over. There will be a link available. I believe it'll be off of the Known World Symposium website, and you'll be able to go and grab the slides from there. So if you want to look at some of this in more detail, you will have an opportunity for that later. So talking about commonalities and differences that we see across these portraits and these garments. So the main thing is we see that full body, we see that full sleeve. Pretty much all of these look gathered, although they may be very tiny pleats, but they're not like knife pleated or box pleated. It would be tiny pin pleats. Pretty much all of the Camicias, both in portraiture and extant that we have, are made of white fabric. They do look to primarily be linen. The neckline is pretty much always stitched in place. Certainly in the extant garments they are, and I personally don't see any evidence in the portraiture that would suggest that the necklines were not stitched in place. And you'll also notice, especially in the extant garments, that there are no neckline corners. There is no mitering. It is a straight, or it turns into round, but it is straight band that makes up the neckline. It is not sort of pinched in the corners in any way. And we will talk about that a little bit more when we get to neckline construction and how that all works. But keep in mind, there are no neckline corners. Some differences that we see across of all of these. So one of the big things is that we see a wide variety of different neck and cuff options. So we see ruffles at the neck, we see ruffles at the cuffs, we see no ruffles, we see that they have cuffs, we see that they don't have cuffs. So there's a lot of variation that happens with that, and you can definitely use that, I think, both according to personal preference, but also if you are wanting to evoke a very particular time or place, or evoke a particular portrait, then matching the necklines and the cuffs of the image that you're using for inspiration will really help you with that. So again, differences with necklines, this is another big thing. So sometimes there is that needle lace or needle point, embroidery. Also whether there is embroidery on the body of the garment or not. So a lot of the differences primarily, I would say, have to do with decoration more than construction. We see a very consistent silhouette in terms of like what is happening with the fullness of the garments in the portraiture. And we see a pretty consistent set of construction methods through the extant garments that we have information about the construction. The only real difference being that side panel versus not side panel. And like I say, that's primarily just about how wide of fabric is available to you. So, any questions before we move on to measuring and cutting?
No questions in the chat, but we do have a comment.
Okay.
Madalena said that in the Met they do actually have an example of an extant polychrome Camicia, and as like a fun little tidbit.
Okay. So as I said, rules are made to be broken. And I would love to have a link to that polychrome Camicia if anybody has a link. Okay, so measuring and cutting. The first thing I'm going to say when it comes to measuring and cutting is, in my opinion, there is such thing as too much fabric to put in your Camicia. I originally did not think this. I thought if I have the width of fabric, like if I have, 54 inches of fabric to put in my body panels and gather down into this Camicia, that's going to be great. Why wouldn't I? And what I discovered is there is such thing as too much fabric. And there's two main things that can mean that you have too much fabric. One has to do with the actual neckline. So when you're trying to gather a lot of fabric into a very narrow little neckband, what can happen is that the neckband ends up becoming kind of hard. This is the Camicia that I'm wearing right now is my one that I would say has too much fabric in it. And you can see I did quite a narrow neckline, and this neckband is quite stiff. And particularly at the shoulders, it can actually dig in and be kind of uncomfortable. Now, that might be able to be rectified a little bit by having a slightly wider neckband, because there would be more room in the neckband for all of that fabric to squish into. But that being said, the other thing with having too much fabric is that you're also having to squeeze all of that fabric down inside your dress. And while nice thin linen, you shouldn't have too much of a problem having gathers of fabric under a dress. There is such thing as too much fabric gathered in under your dress, and it can end up being a little bit uncomfortable. So I have some general recommendations about sizing that I have found across a variety of shapes and sizes of people that I have made Camicia for, works pretty well across most shapes and sizes. I have a note later about basically if you have a size that is bigger than, then maybe think about adding additional. But outside of that, I would stick with the basic measurements because otherwise you can distinctly end up with too much fabric. So in its basic state, the Camicia is essentially 2 squares, your gussets, and 4 rectangles, your front body panel, your back body panel, and your 2 sleeves. That being said, sometimes, depending on the length of your arm, you may end up with squares for your sleeves. So then you end up with 4 squares and 2 rectangles. And again, depending on how long you want your body panels to be, those could end up being square too. So maybe you're just going to end up with 6 squares, but some version of 6 squares and rectangles. In order to, this is a really simple thing to measure. The only things that we need measurements for are, we need your arm length, we need how long you want your Camicia to be, and that is measured from whatever height you want your neckline to sit at to wherever you want the Camicia to end on your body. Personally, I recommend somewhere between just below the knee and just above the ankle. I would not personally recommend having a Camicia that is longer than that. And generally, I would say somewhere in that mid-calf range is the most comfortable length for Camiciae. And then the other thing that you need is a neckline measurement, and if you are making cuffs, a cuff measurement. So for your neckline, you are primarily going to be using the neckline of the dress that you are planning on wearing with it, and then thinking about, based on when it's being made for, to what extent does it need to be smaller than the neckline or the same as the neckline? Because as we saw in those portraits, there's a number of time periods where the Camicia basically sits flush with the neckline of the dress. And then there are other periods where we see the Camicia peeking up a little bit or see the neckband of the Camicia above the neckline of the dress. So you want to measure out that neckline, and that, or just smaller than that, will be the length of your neckband. In terms of cuffs, there are 2 different places that you can measure cuffs depending on what you are wanting to do with your cuffs. So the obvious thing is that you can measure your cuffs at your wrist. However, if you are not planning on having tie closed cuffs and you are planning on having stitched closed cuffs, I recommend thinking about whether you may want to be able to push your sleeves up past your wrists. And if that is the case, I highly recommend taking a measurement either from just below or just above or right at your elbow, so that the cuff is large enough that you can push it up. And the thing is that even at that kind of a size, it is not huge around the wrist, and it's not going to get too much in the way, and it will keep that fabric more under control at your wrist than having them completely loose. So those are the only measurements that you're going to need. So then in terms of how what you actually then do with the measurements. So the first thing I normally think about in terms of sizing is the gussets. The gussets are 8 to 9 inches, pretty much regardless of your size. You can go a little smaller or a little bigger, but all of the extant pieces are around that size. And I found as long as it's kind of in that size, it's going to be pretty comfortable regardless of your size. So I highly recommend just pick 8 or 9 and just go with that. The body panels are, that's not correct. hang on. That may be the body panels of the extant ones. I'm not sure now. I'm so confused. Yeah, so I think this is the measurements of the extant ones. The body panels are between 24 and 28 inches. That being said, I do make my body panels wider than that. But like I say, there is kind of there's a point of too much. And so, yeah, with the width that I'm going to share on the next slide, basically, as long as you have a largest measurement in your torso that is under 50 inches, you should be fine. If you do have a measurement that is larger than 50 inches circumference, then you may want to size up your body panels, but do be cautious about how much you're adding, and potentially open up that neckline a little bit and make sure that you're thinking through what's going to happen with the neckline. Yeah, and this is where the bigger of a neckline you have, circumference of the neckline, the more fabric you can get away with gathering into it, because it's going to be less densely packed if that neckline is bigger. So if your neckline is bigger, then you can put more fabric in. So just sort of keep in mind that proportion as you're figuring out your measurements. And then, so your body panels, you measure the width, which is actually, I think in mine, closer to like 44 inches. And then the length is the length measurement that you took. And then the arms, that's what that's supposed to be. The arms are 24 to 28 inches wide. And then they're the length of your arm that you took, which should be from the top of your shoulder to your wrist, or slightly longer, because these are quite puffy and you do want to have room to puff them. I generally take the length from the top of my shoulder down a crooked arm, and I take it all the way to my knuckles. Okay, so this is the measurements that I have for my favorite Camicia, which is not the one that I'm wearing. It's this one here. And this is my one that does not have cuffs. And it has 9-inch gussets. The body panels are 44 inches wide and 50 inches long. The sleeves are 28 by 28. And the neckline is gathered to 45 inches. So in discussing the neckline here, the other thing I will mention briefly, we'll get into this more when we talk about necklines, I highly recommend having a 2-part neckline, a front and a back, that is stitched together, and then you gather your neckband to it. You then have a clear place of where the Camicia is going to sit on your shoulder, particularly because generally speaking, there is more neckline at the front of most dresses compared to the amount of neckline that there is at the back. And so having a clear spot of knowing, like, this is where it's supposed to sit on my shoulder and there's enough in the front and enough in the back is really helpful when you're getting dressed. And generally speaking, I find it more comfortable. The other thing is, you do want to think about how much of what you are gathering where, because you are gathering both the sleeve and the body panel into the same neckline. You want to make sure that you have left both the same and enough of the sleeve, and then you can always push more of the gathers into the body, if that makes sense. We will talk about that more when we get to the neckline, but just keep that in your brain as we discuss. Okay, so layout. This is my tiny little mock-up model that I made. Because I was realizing as I was prepping for this class that it's very difficult for me to show you what is happening with a full-sized model of this item. So this is my mini model that we have. So we have a little version in person here that we can use to discuss things as well. But so this is the basic pieces that you are looking at. So we have our two big body panels, we have our sleeves, and we have our gussets. Excuse me. So, excuse me again. So in terms of cutting these out, generally speaking, what I do is I figure out how big my fabric is. I grab some grid paper. I figure out what my measurements of these square/rectangles are going to be. And then I just try and figure out, you know, what is the best way of putting them together to make sure that I am using my fabric as conservatively as I can. And this is certainly where, like I say, it can be really, really tempting to just use the entire width of your fabric, because you go, oh, well, I have a 54-inch wide and I want a 44-inch wide body panel. Well, now I have 10 inches. I can't make a sleeve out of that. But first of all, you can make gussets out of it because the gussets are about 8 to 10 inches. And additionally, you're going to have quite a long section of it, and it's great for cuffs and neckbands. So, and this is also the approximate layout of how these items are going to get stitched together. So as you can see, the sleeve is going to attach to the body panel on both sides, and then the gusset is going to go in under the arms. And once you've folded the sleeves over and you put those two body panels, this is kind of the front view of what that is going to look like. So, quick pause. I know I have been running really quickly through this section. So does anybody have any questions before I move into more detailed construction notes?
We do actually have a question in the comments.
Perfect.
When you guys were mentioning the body panels and you were giving the 24 to 28 as seeming narrow, were those half widths or what was the deal with that?
So just pulling this up on another screen here. Give me a second. 5, 10, 15, 20, 25. So they're not half panels. Those are the widths of the full body panels in Patterns of Fashion. But that is, in my opinion, quite narrow. So I would say if you are smaller, that might be a set of measurements that might work. But I know that my Camicia are not that narrow in the body panels. So, yeah, and I know that weirdly it's the one that has the narrow panels and the wide panels. The narrow panel plus the wide panel is what measures 44 inches. That was the basis of my, because this one is actually made with side panels and body panels. And if you measure the body panel and then you add a single side panel to that, that's 44 inches. So I apparently didn't take a close enough look at that, but I would guess that the ones in Patterns of Fashion were just made for some smaller people. Yeah.
Could very well possibly be, but thank you for clarifying that.
Definitely. Okay, so moving on to construction. So this is a relatively simple construction. We've got gussets, we've got some sleeves. There are lots of tutorials and demonstrations, including Morgan Donner's video on gussets, that are very good and go into far more depth than I am going to be going into tonight. However, I do want to go over a couple of things with how the gussets go in, and also one sort of tip/trick about gussets, depending on how you're dealing with your fabric. So what I mean by that is, okay, so the first thing is, when I put these together, I always sew the gusset to the sleeve and complete the sleeve first, and then sew the sleeve onto the body panel. It gives you more control, in my opinion, and it helps you see what's happening, and especially because that join between the sleeve and the body panel is quite small, and you're only really setting it down a couple of inches. And so if you try and stitch the gusset into the body panel first and then stitch the sleeve onto that, it's really easy to not have quite left yourself enough room. And so I highly recommend starting with the gusset. Now, this is the weird little tippy trick thing about gussets. So this was obviously hand sewn because it's like an inch long. And if you are hand sewing gussets, like, you can just stitch into the corner, turn, and keep going. Hand sewing gussets can make gussets really nice and simple, but there's still a lot of long seams and stuff. So if you are sewing a gusset with a machine, often the technique that gets taught is that you have to be super, super precise. Okay, and so that you have to go right into that corner that is exactly a half, like your seam allowance of like half it, and then you have to stop right at that exact point, and then you do your next side. And I will say that if you are going to be finishing your seams with a felled technique, or if you're wanting to do French seams, then that really is the technique that you have to use, and you have to be super precise about it. I, on the other hand, am someone who does not tend to be super precise, especially when I'm using a machine. And so if you either A, are going to finish the edges before you stitch the garment together, either with a zigzag stitch or a serged, or maybe even you're going to roll it over and top stitch it, or if you're okay with having a little corner that isn't fully encased, and that if you are going to fell your seams, you're going to have to sort of do the corners of it as you go, then this technique might be for you. So the way that it works is you start by just stitching the gusset to the sleeve. You don't have to worry about a seam allowance on the sides. You can stitch the whole way across it. Where is my thread? There it is. Oh, nope, not that one. Yeah, so you can just stitch all the way from one edge to the other edge, which is what you're seeing on the image there, and what we're also doing on camera right here. So we've just got that stitch like that. So this is the width of your sleeve, and this is the length of your sleeve. Okay, and then this side is the other side that is going to be being stitched to the other side of the sleeve. Okay, and so what you're going to do is you are going to take the gusset edge and line it up with the corner of that sleeve. And then you are going to push it down like a triangle and pop a pin in it so that it lays flat across from the bottom of your cuff all the way to the inside of that gusset. And this has to get sort of pushed open. And like I say, if you are wanting to finish the seams, what you have to do is in this corner where you're just going to be stitching straight across, you have to tuck it in right there along where you're going to stitch across. Okay. And then what you're going to do is you're just going to stitch straight across that seam. And you are going to end up with something that looks like that. So it just goes straight. I think I have an example of it in this one. Can't remember if I used that technique on this one or not. This one is so old. No, I did something different with that one. Never mind. But yeah, so like I say, for me, and because if you do it that way, you're just, it's already been stitched on that side and you're just stitching straight across it. It's hard to explain why, but it always gives you that perfect corner, and you don't end up with like, oh, did I get it right in that exact same spot? This is unfortunately harder to explain with visuals and on video. So if this isn't making sense, I apologize. But yeah, that is that. So then once you have that sleeve stitched together, then what you're going to do is you're going to pin it to the body with that 2 to 6 inches of the arm being attached to the body panel. So you can see there you've got the gusset, and then you've got a little bit of arm that is also stitched to the body panel and stitched all the way down. But that being said, you have to do it on one side and then to the other side of the body panel and close it the same way that we closed the armhole. So yeah, then you sew the sides together, and then you have one entire finished little seam. So you have that, you have your gusset, and you have that. And like I say, the really key thing with getting these to sit right is just making sure that you have that like minimum 2 inches of sleeve that is actually attached to the body panel. And then we have our other sleeve, and that would go in there. Okay, I am going to stop sharing my screen at this point. We're going to talk about necklines and cuffs, but before we get to necklines and cuffs, I would like to see if there are any questions about construction, because I know that that was kind of confusing.
I actually have a question.
Please.
So I tried making my first Camicia style smock about January of this year.
Okay.
And I did the offset. I was following the one on Realm of Venus, did the offset with the sleeve onto the body panel. And I found I ended up with like a lot of underarm, you know, where it kind of puts in that diagonalness into the body. Yeah, so I ended up with a lot of tightness there. And so I'm just wondering, maybe I should have done a little more of the sleeve onto the neckline or a little less. Maybe a bigger gusset.
So I think it actually may have more to do with whether you may have gathered too much of the sleeve into the neckline, and you may have contracted the sleeve into too small of a space. And so instead of sitting nicely all the way across your shoulder and having the gusset sitting at approximately this level, it's pulling up into your neckline. That being said, that is one of the problems that I have had with this one, which is my, again, ironic because this is the one that has way more fabric in it. But there is not a significant difference in the amount that I have there or the amount that I have in the gusset. I have found that weirdly, it has more to do with the neckline than it has to do with that. That being said, I think adding a little bit more depth could give you more room. So you could experiment with adding a little bit more sleeve added to the body, because if there is additional sleeve that is set into the body, that part of the sleeve cannot be gathered. And so you are getting additional structured depth into your armpit. And similarly, adding a little bit of extra, like I say, there is a range of gusset sizes. So adding another inch into your gusset and seeing if that helps definitely is an option. And it definitely, there is an aspect to which it does depend a bit on like the distribution of how your body sits, exactly what you're gonna be the most comfortable with in terms of how much gusset, how much sleeve is set in, and all of that stuff. But I would definitely recommend keeping an eye on how small of a space your sleeve is being gathered to. And I would actually almost measure from, having a hard time figuring out what to call it, but basically it's that join that's like right here at the front to the same spot exactly at the back, and make sure that your sleeve is actually covering that distance and that you're not pulling the body panel up into that distance. Any other questions?
Not seeing any here in the chat, so.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a teeny tiny bit more about necklines and then about cuffs. Okay, so I already talked really briefly about the fact that drawstrings on necklines are terrible, and also that front and back necklines are nice. But we're just going to get a little bit more into detail about that and about various different options. So, like with the back and front neckline bands, to me, it's about comfort. A drawstring neckline is going to shift on you. It's not super comfortable. You're going to be fussing with it a lot. And then on top of that, we don't have any evidence of drawstring necklines where they were tied. So to be clear, we have evidence of Camicia that have an opening at the front and that are tied closed, but it is still a fixed neckband. It is not a string that you pull tighter or let looser, okay? There is a few paintings where there is an actual opening and it is tied shut and we can see like a little ribbon there, but it's not a drawstring. So for both of those reasons, I highly recommend against drawstring necklines. That being said, there are a number of different treatments that you can use at your neckband depending on what kind of look you are wanting to achieve. So the simplest version is a neckline like what I am wearing, or like what I have on my other Camicia. And this is just a straight strip of fabric that has been cut, and you stitch it down, and then you flip it over and you tuck it under and you stitch it down again. And it just encases the top of that edge and finishes it off super nicely and clamps all those gathers in place. Another option, if you are wanting ruffles, is that you can do pretty much the same thing, but instead of having a single piece that stitches on, folds over, and stitches, you actually make a two-part band and you squash a set of ruffles on the one side. So you have ruffles on one side, you have a band, and then the band gets stitched to your neckline. However, that's not the only way that you can do ruffles. Another way that you can do ruffles is you can finish the top of your neckband. So you can make a nice little edge, you can roll it under and finish that hem however you want. If you are doing this, I would highly recommend a very narrow hem at that top. And then what you're going to do is you're going to run your gathering stitch, and you're going to tighten it down to whatever amount of gathering you need. And then there are two different options. Option one is you can take a little band that has the edges folded in and is all the edges are tucked in underneath. And you can put this on the back of this, and you can pin and eventually sew that band to those gathers at the back. So the band goes along where the gathering stitches are, and then you stitch above and below, and that secures your gathers in place and gives you a nice flat band at the back, which is super comfortable.
Excuse me a minute. In the second one you showed with
Yep.
the ruffle at the top,
Yep.
was that a separate ruffle sewn
Yes.
onto the thing? Okay,
Correct.
great.
Yeah. So basically there's separate ruffle where there's a band, and then the ruffle is gathered in, and then the neckline is gathered in below the band. Or this is, we're now talking about two different ways to do an integrated ruffle. So option one is you put that band across the back. And then option two is that what you're actually going to do is once you've got these gathers all pulled in, you're actually going to take your needle and you're just basically going to backstitch through those gathers, pulling them tight and securing them in place. The main reason why I don't necessarily recommend this option is because it is harder to make sure that the size of the neckline is what you want it to be. When you are using a band, whether that's, like I say, a band at the back that's hidden, or a band that's at the top, or a band that's in between, it's a lot easier to make that band the neckline that you want and then stitch to that band. Where if you do it freehand, it's a lot easier to accidentally end up with too much or too little neckline. Does everything make sense? And then of course, if you do a neckline like this, where there's a band, you can then add additional decoration from that band, like needle lace or bobbin lace or embroidery on the front side of that band. All of those are options. And although it sounds like I am beating a dead horse, again, doing a front neckline and a seam and then the back neckline will make it a lot easier to wear and a lot more comfortable in my experience. That being said, despite that being something that I highly endorse, a lot of people, because a lot of Italian garments have slightly squared necklines, people are very tempted to put a nice little corner in their necklines so that it sits straight and like goes right into the corner. What I have found is that with a properly fitted overgown, if you reach up under your skirt and you take the corners of your Camicia and you just pull those corners, they're gonna tuck right in there. And you really don't need the mitered corner. And as I said, there's no evidence of those mitered corners in any of the extant items. So I highly recommend giving it a try. The other thing that is nice about it, about not mitering the corners, is if you end up getting a different overgown that has a slightly different neckline, maybe it sits a little lower or a little higher, even though your Camicia may not be perfect to the neckline of that dress because it wasn't fitted to that dress, if you don't have mitered corners, you can pull it into the neckline to fit the neckline of a different dress in a way that works much better than if those corners are permanent. So it just gives you a little more flexibility. Any questions about necklines?
Not seeing anything in the chat.
Perfect. All right, so we are on to our last little bit, which is cuffs. So personally, I don't actually like cuffs. I am a huge proponent of cuffless Camicias. We do have a couple of those images that do look like they do not have cuffs or definitely don't have cuffs. And personally, I find that they are more easily managed under my sleeves, my oversleeves, despite what you might think. You might think, oh, I want to have a cuff because then when I put my sleeve on, it'll all go nicely. I have not found that to be the case. I find that my cuffless Camicias are a lot easier to deal with underneath oversleeves because I can sort of tuck them and pull them however I want, depending on the sleeve that I'm wearing, instead of being rigidly tied to the size of this cuff. And that being said, all of the extant ones that we have are cuffed, and cuffs are perfectly appropriate, and you can absolutely cuff your sleeves. And basically cuffs can be done in any of the ways that we just described for necklines, in terms of a band with a ruffle with a band on the back, or just ruffles stitched down. Any of those are completely acceptable and appropriate. And while we don't have any extant versions or anything where we can specifically see that this is the case, I would also make the case that it would not be inappropriate to make a cuff like a shirt cuff, where it's actually open and the cuff ties closed. So you can see on this is a shirt, not a Camicia, but so you would have an opening in the shirt, you would have the cuff on top of that opening, and then you would have some kind of a tie to close that cuff. I would recommend a much narrower cuff than what we see on a lot of shirt sleeves for a Camicia, but I think a tie-on cuff would not be inappropriate, even though we don't have specific evidence to say, yes, this was definitely a thing. We know shirts were being closed that way in Italy in this time period. I don't think it's that far of a stretch to say that that would be a reasonable option. And it does provide a little bit more flexibility than a closed cuff, because you do have that option to have it fit really tight at the wrist, but also be able to open it up and push it above your elbow, which, you know, we're not all noble people, and we actually do have to do our own dishes a lot of the time. And being able to push your sleeves up above your elbows can be very helpful. Anything else that want to say about cuffs? Yeah, basically, you don't have to put cuffs on. That's like, I think most people think that you must cuff Camicias. So that's my like big thing that I always try and tell people is you don't have to cuff them, but you absolutely can cuff your Camicia, and you can cuff them in whatever way you choose. And with that, I think we are technically at the end of the information that I had prepared to impart to all of you. But if anybody has any additional questions about anything to do with Camicia that I have not covered, please feel free to ask, and I would be happy to answer anything that I can or incite further discussion with the rest of the group if I can't.
I actually have a question.
Definitely.
When it comes to the Camicia, because I know that we use the term both for the feminine and the masculine version of the garment, what kinds of differences in the actual design or construction would we see between the two variations, if any?
Yeah, so definitely what I would say is you don't really see the low-necked version of a Camicia in a men's garment. So there are just, although there are high-necked versions that are very much exactly like a men's shirt, that we do see some versions of for women. The main differences in terms of construction is that, generally speaking, when you are pulling up to an actual neckband, you are going to want to put, well, actually, no. So there's two things. So first of all, you actually sew shoulder seams in your body panels with a shirt. And the sleeves are then sewn onto the body panels completely, because it's not a neckline, it's a different type of neckline. And then the neckband, generally speaking, at the shoulders, you're going to have a little set of gussets, little triangles that are going to be set into those shoulders, that then that part doesn't get gathered, and then it gets gathered behind and gets gathered in front into that neckband. So yeah, and it is still like a really, like, basically you take your like body width and you like times it by 5. That's your body panel. But then you measure your shoulders and you leave that, the actual shoulders, and then you just cut slightly down in the front and the back, and then all of that gets gathered into the neckline.
Good to know. Thank you so very much for elaborating on that.
Absolutely. Patterns of Fashion, again, I will plug Patterns of Fashion 4, has a lot of shirt patterns and shirt diagrams. And also, if you want to geek more about shirts, just hit me up and I will talk your ear off about shirts too. Maybe next time I'll do this with shirts and low neck and high neck. Maybe we'll do that next time.
Sounds like a plan. I'm not
cool.
seeing any other questions in the chat.
Okay.
Angelina said, thank you so very much for the class.
You're so very welcome.
And again, personally, thank you because this was actually a really interesting class. So
Yay, I'm so glad. So yeah, I'll definitely hang out for a bit, but we can maybe end the recording.
sounds good.
And yeah, I'll hang out for a bit. If anybody does think of any additional questions that they want to ask or things that they want to discuss, we can carry on. We technically have the room for a while, but we can end the recording. Thank you all so much for coming. I really enjoyed this. I hope you did too.
And you said you'd be putting the slides in the accessible handout section of the event.
Yes, I am going to make a couple of updates based on things that we ran into today. And then I am going to put it on the Google Drive, and I will let Talina know to upload it to the place where the handouts go.
Thank you.
fantastic. And at that, I'm going to press the